What's going on, everybody? This is Alex, a doctoral candidate at NUS Business School in Singapore, and I welcome you to another episode of the 4Sight Chats. In each episode of this series, I have a conversation with a leading figure in the field of futures and foresight, to whom I try to ask crucial, difficult, sometimes ignored, sometimes even not so politically correct questions about the field and about the futures in general, encouraging critical discussions that perhaps have not been heard of. One of the major focal issues of this series is teaching and researching the futures, which of course also involves publishing about it. Because the interest in futures and foresight is increasing among researchers and practitioners alike, I think it is crucial to spread awareness about what are the major journals where we can publish conceptual, methodological and theoretical articles about the futures and about futures and foresight practices and processes. That is why in this episode I'm talking with someone who really can tell us a lot about that. So let me introduce you to the guest I'm speaking to today, Ted Fuller. Ted is the editor-in-chief of Futures, one of the most well-regarded journals in futures and foresight, and UNESCO Chair of Responsible Foresight for Sustainable Development at Lincoln International Business School in the UK. In my conversation with Ted, we really dig deep in the publication process of the journal. We talk about what kinds of articles the journal is looking forward to publishing, what are the red flags for rejected articles, and how the review process looks like. We also touch upon the future of publishing, the future vision of the journal, and how to put together good pitches for special issues, for which the journal Futures is well known. So if you have been considering to write for a journal in the field of futures and foresight, or if you want to learn more about how to do it, this is a great conversation to listen to. Finally, I asked Ted some advice on how to conduct research and teaching on futures and foresight in a business school, which is usually an environment that doesn't really incentivize futures and foresight as a discipline. I hope that you will enjoy the conversation. Ted, thanks so much for being on the show. I have been looking forward to this for a while. It is a real honor.
Thank you for inviting me, Alessandro. Hope I can help in some way.
For sure you will. So you are the editor-in-chief of Futures, which is one of the major and most well-regarded journals in the field of futures and foresight, arguably the most well-regarded. So a bad way to say that would be that you are one of the gatekeepers of the profession, but a good way to say that would be that you have so much interesting information for us in the field, and that makes you a super interesting person to talk to. On the top of that, you are also based on a business school, which is to me especially interesting because I'm also based on a business school, and it's always super interesting to learn how people successfully manage to pursue research and teaching about the future in an environment that usually does not teach the future so much, right? So I do have a lot of questions for you, but I want to start from the basics. So please allow me a dumb question, and this is also because a lot of listeners might actually not be aware of what the journal Futures is about. So why don't we start by really telling us briefly what the journal is about, when it started, when you started to be an editor, just the basic information about the journal, and then we can start go deeper.
Okay, well, I'll try to do that. The journal celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2018, so it started in 1968, and I took over the editorship in January 2012 from Zia Sadar, who many people watching this will know very well. And it's an international refereed, multidisciplinary journal concerned with medium and long-term futures of culture, society, science, technology, economics, politics, environment, the planet, individuals, humanity, quite a wide-ranging set of themes. It covers methods and practices of future studies, and we publish new contributions to knowledge, examine possible alternative futures of all or any human endeavors, as well as humankind's multiple anticipatory relationships with its futures. And we seek to promote divergent, pluralistic visions and ideas about the future based on research and scholarly reasoning. And that's exactly what it says on the tin when you go to the Futures website and read about the scope of the journal. Strangely, many of the authors who submit papers don't appear to have read that, which tends to mean a rapid departure of the paper from this particular journal, however good the papers are more generally.
I'm gonna go on and catch you just right on that point. Do you mean that a lot of authors that send manuscript to the journals, to journal Futures, actually don't have a clear idea about what the journal is, and they just write something that is about the future but might not be related to future studies? Or yeah, I just want to know more about what do you mean by many of those who want to be authors don't happen to have read the manifesto.
Yes, well, I mean, typically I'll get some kind of some paper with a piece of research that covers the last 3 years and has a sample size of X, 100, 200, and in the final paragraph it says future research, and that's the only time the word future is mentioned in the article. It has absolutely no explanation about what its relationship is to future studies. It doesn't access any of the literature. It's just completely out of scope. And there seems to be an increasing trend of people just firing their papers to many different journals, or maybe it gets bounced from one journal, so they submit to another journal without actually looking to check too carefully if it's in scope, and leaving all the work for the editor, poor soul, to do instead.
That's a tough job.
So that's a small point. I think I should also be more positive. Some of the papers we get are brilliant and absolutely fantastic. And what's interesting is how the journal has and hasn't changed over the last 3 years. When I took over the editorship, I looked at the first editorial in 1968, which was entitled "Confidence from Chaos." Okay, and it was this idea that professional forecasters would find ways of reducing the margin of error, as they called it, reducing insecurities resulting from rapid change, and requiring expertise within disciplines and between disciplines to do that. And it was expected to lead to more desirable futures, making explicit even then that futures were made and not discovered. Now, fast forward 2012, when we took over, and I reread the editorial that Zia and I wrote jointly at that point. And the title of that was "Moving Forward with Complexity and Diversity," a much more constrained and humble approach, I think, recognizing in particular that greater cultural value related to the future was actually generative of complexity. The more innovation, the more change, the more people have agency to change the future, then the greater will be uncertainty, what Beck calls a risk society. So futures-related activity generates complexity rather than reducing uncertainty and insecurity. So it actually generates it. So it's this relationship between societies and their futures that is the necessary focal point for future studies and for the journal. We can't control our futures. We can certainly control ourselves, and we can be aware of some, if not all, of the consequences of our actions. So I think that's the shift from a kind of almost a scientific belief that you could reduce the margin of error in thinking about the future, to a greater acceptance of diversity, plurality, and complexity that's generative of even being concerned with the future and trying to change the future. So it's a very different perspective. Nevertheless, much of the idea that the founders started the journal with, which is to develop more rigorous methods, which is to think about long term and medium term, which is to try to reduce insecurity and also the recognition that we were dealing with creating desirable futures, and that was of concern even then, the value that we place on the future. So all of those things are consistent and continue to be important to the journal. Right, that's going on a bit.
That's a great point, actually. I have the editorial you mentioned just right here, moving forward with complexity and diversity. And yeah, I also looked at the editorial, and I actually noticed what you just mentioned. So it seems that we have moved away from the idea of controlling it, the future, and more towards the idea to being being confident in complexity. So it's more about being confident with uncertainty, like letting go the idea that we need to control, but at the same time, still exploring it intensively and rigorously. Am I right?
What people want is comfortable uncertainties. They won't necessarily get them, but that's what they seek.
Yeah, that's a good middle way. So for those who really have not had the chance to take a look at the journal, and I know this might sound as another dumb question, but I'm still gonna go and ask, how does a typical journal article look like? And I know that there's a variety of different styles, but
Sure.
if you had to give like an archetype, a typical style journal article, how does that look like to someone who it's really new to the field?
Okay. Well, first of all, it has to make a contribution to knowledge relating to society's relationships with its future. Now, that might be, typical articles that get published might be something to do with methodological approaches to conceiving future, of philosophical, methodological approaches, or theoretical, if you like, and what it means. Or it might be concerned with future ontologies, so significant contributions to understanding the changing world and society and what we understand of our futures. Or it might be related to capabilities and capacities, such as education, relationship, how we anticipate, how we construct futures, how we understand and interpret futures. So these are the kind of broad categories of papers, which will, build on extant literature, will refer to papers within the broad category of future studies, and there are a dozen journals that cover this field, as you're gradually finding out by interviewing the editors, and as well as multiple books. So there's a lot of literature to build upon, and they will do that, but they will also, each paper will bring about some contribution, whether it's through empirical studies or whether it's through theorizing. There's a variety of possible disciplines and possible ways to generate that new knowledge. And so a typical paper will be probably in one of those categories and will make some kind of contribution, and it will be around about 8,000 words or 9,000 words, give or take a bit, and it will have something to say, and you'll be able to understand it when you read it, and so on. So that's generally, just broadly, what papers are about. They are about the future and our relationship with the future and how that might impinge on the present, of course. Yeah.
That's precious advice, especially to those who might consider attempting to submit something to the journal. How about the red flags that tell you this article is not going to be published on Futures? You already shared one, which is the case where an article is not really concerned with the future, but at the end of the manuscript, just mentioned futures research. All right, that is clearly a red flag. What other red flags tells you, okay, maybe this is not aligned to what we're looking forward to publish?
Well, there's a whole question of quality and rigor. Does it an opinion? Is it an assertion of some point and an opinion? Is the reasoning? I mean, if it is, then it's probably not publishable in an academic journal. Is the argumentation rigorous? Are there any holes in it? Can I understand the language that's being used? Is the English? Is all the publications are in English? The grammar needs to be up to it. But papers can get revised if it's just simply it's saying a great thing but not saying it very well. There are ways to deal with that through revision. So it's the scope of the paper, and then it's the quality of the paper, and a real demonstration that it is rigorous, that is used scholarly methods, that it's used research methods that stand up, that it's not just a couple of people's ideas about how the future should be, or some such list of things. So that's the main criteria, I would say, for rejection, and that may be that's when I read the paper, or it may be that I'm not too sure how good it is. So then it goes out to reviewers, and they come back and say, no, this isn't publishable because, and that gets fed back. So it depends how evident it is that a paper isn't appropriate, depending on how far it gets in the publication process and evaluation progress. I might add then, because what's implied by that is how the peer review process takes place, and it's blind reviewed. Each paper is, first of all, it's desk reviewed by the editor or one of the associate editors, or possibly two of us. I might read a paper, so I'm not sure about this. I'll send this to one of the other editors and ask them for their opinion, and we'll come to some conclusion about whether it's worth taking forward. If so, then it will be sent to at least two peer reviewers. So these are reviewers who have some understanding of the field in which the paper is the topic that the paper is discussing. The reviewers won't know who the author is. It's blind reviewed, and we ask authors to make sure their manuscripts are anonymous. They won't know who the author is. The author won't know who the reviewers are. Sometimes you can pick it up, but normally you can't. And then we'll get some feedback from the reviewers, and then we'll tell the author, this is what the reviewers think, please amend, or sorry, we can't accept, or this is a wonderful paper, we're going to have it straight away, whatever, whichever the decision is that we have to make. And it may go through 3 rounds of reviews before it.
Well, that would be rare. I'm glad you mentioned reviewers. I was talking with Odzhan Saritas, the editor of 4Sight, just a month ago, and he mentioned that finding reviewers is one of the most challenging things in editorial work in this field. So do you second Odzhan, and is that a real challenge for the Journal of Futures as well?
Yes, one of the issues, I think, well, there are a couple of things. First of all, there is undoubtedly a huge growth in academic papers and in academic activity and people trying to publish. And that puts huge demands on the research community in terms of peer reviews. So people get asked to do a lot more than they have otherwise. At the same time, I think academic work is more challenging, and therefore people don't have as much time. So all of that makes it actually difficult just to find the space. However willing people are to review papers, just the capacity to do so is difficult, and that slows down the overall publication process. The second thing is about futures work. Particularly when you're thinking about futures ontology, i.e. the futures of X, Y, or Z, future of healthcare or the future of robots or something. Then while it's important for the paper to be reviewed by someone from the field of future studies who understands the methodology, the techniques, the kind of claims to knowledge that can be made, it's also important to have the paper reviewed by somebody who understands that particular domain. So whether it's robots or health services to tell whether the claims being made about the data are substantial or not. And as sometimes happens, you get a paper which says all the things that everyone already knew in that domain. They're just trying to find another outlet for saying the same old stuff. And I wouldn't necessarily know that and pick that up if I hadn't used a peer reviewer from the domain. So therefore, the scope one needs of reviewers is quite wide. And I have hundreds of reviewers on my lists, which has just built up over the years from suggested reviewers, from people who have published in Futures, of a wide variety of sources. And sometimes it's really difficult to get reviewers, and at other times it works really, really well. So, but yes, it's always a challenge for those reasons.
And to make it clear, usually the articles are sent to 2 reviewers, right? Or even 3 reviewers?
Yeah.
And how long does it take on average to get an article published?
Well, one asks them to review within a month or 6 weeks. And some, maybe half the time they're within that kind of scope. Sometimes it gets pushed a bit, and sometimes it might take 3 or 4 months to reply. We can time out people if they haven't responded within a certain time, and we do that. But you then have to start all over. So if a paper goes out for review and both reviewers accept the review and then don't review it because of challenges to their, whatever their workload is, it goes past 2 or 3 months, and then you've got no reviews, so you have to start over again. So some papers have been in the review process for a year, like that, which is not what one would want. One wants to see the papers through in 2 or 3 months.
Absolutely.
But because of the challenges that you've already mentioned, despite the fact we've got a pretty good tracking system and the editorial management system, it's still ultimately reliant on voluntary peer review, and people have lives and have challenges, and you have to respect that. You want good reviewers. Ultimately, you want a good reviewer, and you want good quality papers at the end of the process, and that's going to take time. It's why, in a way, the increased use of preprints is important. Preprints are the kind of things that you put out your paper before it's peer reviewed. It will go onto some kind of repository or platform, so it will be open for comments. And I can see that's the way publishing might go increasingly, because it does get it out there. And as far as a journal's concerned, while a journal wouldn't publish a paper that's already been published somewhere else, preprints are not counted in that process. So just because an article's been in preprint doesn't stop it from being published after the review process. Obviously, it's a different paper by the time it's finished the review process in any case, largely. It does make the author more likely to be identified by reviewers, and that's unavoidable. What's important is you get good reviews of the paper at the end of the day.
I'm going to expand on your point since you mentioned preprints, and that's an interesting issue. When you say preprints, I guess you also mean those articles that are informally posted on websites such as Academia, EDU, or ResearchGate, and authors ask for comments, right? Do you see this as something that can replace on the long run, right? Trying to be a bit future minded for a second. Do you see this as something that could replace the publication process in that if these platforms become more official, and if articles are to be informally reviewed to a point where they really improve and they get really good, then the journalists don't need it anymore? What do you think about that?
Yes, that's my sense of the direction of travel. open access, dynamic peer review is likely to become more prevalent. I also wonder whether academic publishing may become more increasingly niche. Knowing more and more about less and less until, as the joke goes, you know everything about absolutely nothing. But Futures tends to address global challenges that requires multidisciplinary approaches. Anyway, we can say more about that in a moment. But the idea of a more open and dynamic, transparent process of peer review and commentary seem appropriate for the time. The challenge is, I think, quality and truthfulness.
That's right.
And make the trustworthiness of the review process out there in a transparent way. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong, but that's an area where I would see further development. Yeah, sure.
I agree with you. On one hand, I see this as a tremendous opportunity to speed up the process, because if you think about a website like ResearchGate or Academia, and if you see those websites projected in time, in 10 years from now, right? And the people who are increasingly on those websites, well, it is just very possible that the sheer attendance rate of people commenting those articles might increase to a point where it's very optimal, right? It's much more optimized to post something there, and you get so much feedback straight away, very, very fast. While on the other hand, journals are very slow to respond, right? But on the other hand, there is this issue which you mentioned, that is, how do you guarantee that kind of review is rigorous and it actually makes it a good article? So there is tension there that is quite interesting.
It is. I mean, it's quite easy to develop bots that will give you 100 comments on a paper, all of which are kind of designed.
Sure. I'm curious, what other challenges are there as an editor? So that could be in the editorial process itself, or also as an editor, because the job of an editor is inherently a difficult one. What other challenges have you faced along the way?
Well, I'm not sure it's a challenge, but the one aspect is the relentless excitement of the journal. It's like people's expectations may be a bit high in terms of how fast you can deal with things, but that's one challenge. I think more kind of more openly, the challenge is about keeping an open mind. The challenge is about not making judgments too soon about things under pressure of time, but to give things sufficient time and sufficient thought. And even when you're desk rejecting a paper, to be able to give at least some reading of the paper and some useful help to the author. Not always possible when they're so out of scope. But so the challenge there is the investing time. What's the journal for? Is the journal there to get higher and higher impact factor rates from a smaller and smaller number of people, or this is a rhetorical question, obviously. Is it there to develop the field? Is it there to develop the whole field? And how do you do that? And for me as editor, that's what I think the mission of the journal is. It's not to have higher and higher impact factor, very useful though that can be, because it attracts more high quality papers, strangely, but that isn't the fundamental role of the journal. The fundamental role of the journal is to develop the field and to reach out to other communities, because future studies is multidisciplinary, and to try to involve them and bring them in. And that's a tension, because their methodologies and their perspectives are not the same as future studies. And so how do you start to bridge these things? And we publish a lot of special issues on topics which are mainly about the future of X and Y, future of particular domains. Not always, but some methodological ones as well. And so you'll get, in those special issues, you'll get papers which don't meet the standards of being so heavily steeped in future studies literature, because you have to take the special issue as a whole. And you're trying to bring people into so the feedback is, well, could you say a bit more about this? Could you give a more focus about the future on this? And so we try to encourage authors to think more futures in their work. But overall, an article collection or special issue is really a body of knowledge about the future of that particular domain. And each paper may not give you that, but taken as a whole, the attempt anyway, at least, is to achieve that. So that's one way in which we address that particular challenge. But developing the field, encouraging, trying to get people who have just finished or just doing their doctorate and get their publications up to standard where that's possible. Not always possible, but where it can be. So that's what consumes much of my time, really, investing in that community.
Wow. So I am glad that you mentioned both the vision of the journal and the special issue, because those two things are actually stuff that I wanted to ask you about. So how about expanding on those? The vision of the journal is something that intrigues me a lot. Okay, so the main mission and vision is expanding the field, as you mentioned, and not really the impact factor. But how about the journal 10 years from now? Let's try to be futurist once again. How do you see the journal evolving in a best case scenario in a decade from now?
Well, I kind of the underlying while the purpose is to develop the field, the vision is still about the quality of humanity's capacity to understand and shape the multiple relationships that humankind has with its future. To be more cognizant of its future, to be more responsible for its future, to be more aware of consequences. So that's still the kind of fundamental contribution to knowledge about that the journal has to make, and increasing the reach to other disciplines is just a way to improve that. So as always, one is looking to improve the rigor of argumentation in the published work, to recognize plurality, multiple disciplinary perspectives on futures, attract international participation. So certainly the more global international participation is one of the things one would, when looking ahead at the journal. Maintaining, developing critical reflexivity in the field to surface explicit values and power relationships. These kind of things is really, it's not so much a scenario of the future, it's a guiding principles to take us into the future, however that emerges. Engaging widely, trying to bring multiple domains into that focus, a kind of the one planet idea. We're all on one planet. How do we think about that? So acting as a guide to uncertain times, and as I said before, society's relationships with its future should inspire people to do good things, generate knowledge, publish new knowledge. All of these things are really guiding principles that take us, rather than having a teleology about where the journal might be in 10 years. If we keep to our principles of good quality research, of broadening the field, of multidisciplinarity, being concerned with our relationship with the future and our responsibilities, that will produce a better journal. It will inspire academics to want to publish and write about these things. So that's the way I think about the future of the journal, to be guided by a set of principles. And yes, things will change. So one has to be reasonably agile in the way technology changes and the way what's taken as authentic has to change. Who knows? We might have a blockchain way of authenticating the quality. You just have to stay open to all of these kind of things. I was musing just before Christmas in a workshop with Oshkan and others. I was musing on the extent to which in 10 years' time the papers would be written by AI bots, as opposed to just the data being generated at the moment by AI bots. And the extent to which we wouldn't need reviewers because the AI bots would just review each other's work, to the point where we wouldn't be able to understand what they were saying to each other.
Well, that's an interesting avenue to watch. Absolutely. So do you see this vision that you just told me as conducive to a wider acceptance of the journal, or you just see the vision as a humanitarian objective regardless of whether the journal is accepted or more? In other words, are you okay if the journal remains a niche and we still publish amazing research, or you also want this increase in rigor, increase in comprehension of the various kind of futures and the schools of thought about the future to lead to a wider acceptance?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the widening, as I've already said, the widening the reach of the journal into many disciplines is really part of the guiding principle, and it's one of the reasons I've got behind the recent changes and a greater concentration on the idea of anticipation. I think Rosen's work on anticipatory systems interesting. I think it gives us a way to think about our relationship with the future, which is different, but more fundamentally, it brings in new disciplines that weren't interested in future studies, but are interested in anticipation. And so it actually widens the scope. It allows people to share knowledge and exchange ideas about thinking about the future, but in a new language, in a new way. So as an example, there are other themes as well, but it's an example of how one is trying to widen contributions and influence of the journal. So no, it's not just about being a niche. On the contrary, I find that difficult. I mean, it is interesting. 1968, the journal and immediate years following that, the journal was a very intellectual journal that encouraged a wide range of contributors by deep thinkers of the day. And I think to some extent that's been lost because there's far more media for that kind of thing to happen now. It's not so possible to concentrate that kind of intellectual rigor in one journal when there's such an explosion, such a development in many fields. And I think that's a loss in a sense. And there's in becoming more and more narrow, and we can't do that. We have to move out of there. We have to develop the capacity more widely to take the future into consideration and see the importance of how ideas about the future causes changes in the present, and that's important right across disciplines.
That's super interesting. So you mentioned Rosen, and I'd like to just chime in on that. You mentioned this as an example, right? So I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that the journal also encourages new kinds of elaboration of the futures by scholars who might not be viewed as futures scholars, but have something to say about the future. So that certainly includes a lot of psychology literature about how the future is
through time travel and the like.
Right, is seen in the mind, right? Or neuro imagining, neuroeconomics literature about how the future is imagined. And there's a lot of stuff going on that we have not picked yet, right? I think that according to what you said, we might be able to draw from in the next few years.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's there in different literatures, like you say, imaginaries, for example, in in sociology or economics.
That's right.
Each discipline has its way of talking about the future. The issue is how important they see that, whether they see that as a result or whether they see that as some kind of input into their into their input into the influence of behavior. Yeah.
Understood. So let's go back on special issues. The journal Futures is, I would say, famous to publish excellent special issues. There is a history of amazing special issues. So you mentioned that the issues, all in all, they might include articles that perhaps might not have been evaluated uh, separately without the idea to be included in a special issue. Or is this the case? How does one put together a special issue? And also, for to someone who actually wants to pitch you a special issue about something that they think it's interesting for futures and foresight, but they are not futures and foresight people, give us some advice about that.
Right. Okay. I'll try. And try to keep it short. I have a kind of 3-page guide which I send to people who
We'll put a link. Yeah.
I say, here's this 3-page guide. See how it stacks up against that. But all the things I've said relate to that. So if you want to pitch a special issue on the future of something, then how is that going to contribute to knowledge? How are the authors who are going to write papers, do they have any idea about future studies? Do they know how to conceive of how the future sits and is performative in their domain? Are you really writing about the future, or are you writing about the present and just doing a little projection? So there are lots of questions, and then I or the editor handling the special issue will require a call for papers, and it could and does can take a long time to get a call for papers to be into shape that I'm prepared to put out there, such that they do deal more directly with ideas of the future. So there's I spend, because of the same idea of the mission, I spend a lot of time not only with individual authors but also with guest editors to get their ideas into a shape that is consistent. Even then, sometimes the special issue fails because, but it's an experiment. We go with it. We try these things out. Some work better than others.
I'm curious, at which stage does it fail? Usually,
well, it failed in the sense of, well, there are some failures in that a special issue will, first of all, I may not accept it, but assuming I do accept it, it gets put out there, and there's an insufficient network of academics to contribute, or it doesn't inspire anyone's imagination. We get 3 papers and none of them make any kind of real serious contribution to knowledge. That's it, game over. Alternatively, if we get 3 papers that are really good, but only 3 papers, well, we'll publish those as a small special issue, as a special subsection or something. But we can make a small collection of articles as an article collection. That's not a problem these days. With all the publication, people read these things online. They tend not to have, there are bound volumes that are published, but people tend not to read bound volumes. Professional academics tend to use so the size of special issues can be 3 papers or 20 papers, as long as they've all something to contribute, and not just noise. And it does give us a little scope to experiment and say sometimes it works better than other times.
I hope that someone will take this advice and submit some pitches. I have another curious question. Recently, I was there at the Futures Literacy Summit, virtually, of course, and I was very positively surprised to see an editors panel, of which you were part. And that was a great panel with a lot of editors of journals in the field. And I was positively surprised because I saw that everyone was saying that we have seen an increase in articles submitted, and the literature is just increasing, expanding. But on the other hand, my feedback, and here I'd like to be the devil advocate for a moment. My feedback is, it's interesting to see that we have not found a distinctive feature of each journal, or at least this is my perception, right? They seem to be similar. So my question to you would be, in the future, does Futures as a journal wish to be different? And I ask you this because when I see other more mature disciplines, right, in the social sciences, I see there are journals that are specifically targeted to conceptual arguments like theory, and some journals are specifically targeted to empirical papers, right? And that makes it a great avenue to not only push research in each and every of those directions, but also to make it clear to authors that it is actually important to write in different directions and the distinction between the different directions. So what do you think about this topic in view of the futures of the journal Futures?
Well, they always evolve. I would say that what's important in Futures Journal, along with all the other things that I've said, is methodological development, is the kind of theories underpinning, where I would say most of the other Futures journals tend to be more professional, more about the practices of future studies or futures education, rather than how we actually improve the underlying rigor. I say most. I can't generalize because this field is still evolving. But I get, and future studies is largely a professional practice, so it's perfectly reasonable that most of the journals should be oriented towards professional practice and improving professional practice.
Okay.
I think Futures Journal it steps back a little bit from that. If I get a paper which is yet another set of scenarios, then that's not me, because it's just another set of scenarios. It doesn't contribute anything to the way you produce scenarios, or it doesn't. So there's the contribution to knowledge in that. So when I talk about contribution to knowledge, I'm talking about contribution to conceptual understanding, as well as possibly understanding better the way that a particular domain is changing. So that's where I see Futures as being, to some extent, distinctive. But of course, all the journals will nibble away at that. If they get a good paper, they're not going to go, "Oh no, this is too theoretical for this paper." They go, "Oh wow, we've got a theory paper." I can't speak for the other editors. There are also different networks associated with different journals, I would say, as well. Some disciplines just want to have people the authors in higher impact factor journals, despite the fact the actual articles aren't necessarily up to that impact factor. But that's a whole nother discussion. Your question about distinctiveness and development and specialization, it will evolve. For sure, it will evolve.
It's emerging, yes. And I believe it eventually will be made clearer along the way if the literature expands to a point that it's just necessary to say, all right, we are different from the other 20 journals because, and then they will force editors to, I guess, find an angle. So that's totally true. It's emerging. What are the major areas? And again, this might sound as another dumb question. Apologies for that. What are the major areas or topics that you prioritize at the moment in the short-term future, if any, in potential contributions?
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting question. I think on the whole, it's not for editors to say what's the most important topic. And that's because there's a great danger in foreclosing the future. If you start to take stances on what's hot and what's not, then you may foreclose the future. The issue is still, is there a contribution to knowledge here? Because that's a new contribution. That contribution only means a new contribution, not the same old thing. And that's important for the field, not rather than the topic. Obviously, when you look at the kind of papers that are coming in and the kind of things that are going on at the moment, they tend to track the emerging issues in society more widely. You're going to get papers on artificial intelligence, on climate change, on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is pretty big field, on the meaning of life, on society, existential risks, uncertainty. These are the kind of topics of the day, the zeitgeist, if you will, and of course COVID right now. So you got, but I don't necessarily look to select one topic over another. My concern is the quality of the research in the paper, and I think it's up to the communities to decide what the important topics are, not an editor to decide. I think what we decide on through the peer review system is quality. So occasionally I will suggest a topic for a special issue, but that's very, very occasional. The last ones I suggested were all about the 50th anniversary of the journal and some broader issues rather than a particular topic. But on the whole, special issues tend to get pitched. Often the advisory board, the journal academic advisory board and editorial board will put forward ideas as well, and I'll discuss with them from time to time areas that may be of interest. So there are various ways in which we arrive at topics. But on the whole, I don't want to foreclose the future through having priorities.
Oh, I love your answer to that. And I'm very happy that Futures is so inclusive. And I hope that this will encourage others who didn't think to contribute to actually possibly contribute, as long as you have the quality there, right? It's not topic driven. I wanna ask you a last question, if I may, and that might depart a bit from the editorial job you have for Futures. You are based in a business school, and you are also an active and prolific Futures researcher. So to me personally, and I guess to many other viewers who are in business schools or related fields, this is super interesting to learn how you manage to do the two things at the same time, because oftentimes the idea to research the futures, right, in a business school is not something that is accepted, and if it is, it might be looked down on, and that is because the paradigm usually in place in business school is more objective, hypothetical, deductive, and so on. So if you had to share some closing advice for aspiring intellectuals or scholars or researchers or teachers who are on one hand interested to study the futures, and on the other interested to have ties with the business schools, what do you say?
Okay, so for the first tip, I'm not going to give loads of tips. I'm just reflecting on my own. For many years, the professorship I had, the chair, was a chair in strategic foresight. Okay, so the first thing, I used the foresight word rather than futures. Secondly, it of course is strategic.
Right. The framing is crucial.
So framing is crucial. Actually, my chairs were in entrepreneurship and strategic foresight. It was even more specific and connected to business schools. And when I started out, it was really interesting. Very briefly, when I started out, I was asked by a client about the future of small business, because small business was my thing, entrepreneurship, small business. That was what I was really interested in at that point. And I was asked about the future of it, and I had no idea how to answer that question. Future of small. So I took time and got some funding and da-di-da, and how you do, and developed ultimately a small business foresight center with half a dozen people working there, researchers and projects and things. So it was about the future of a particular subset of businesses, like 99% of businesses, and grew that, and then things moved on. But that's how it started out. Then I was trying to teach strategic foresight to entrepreneurs, which is fascinating, about scenarios and the like.
Oh yeah.
Doing scenario planning, it's like it was a complete waste of time. Because they don't do, because their world is much more uncertain. Their world is much more dynamic. Their world is much more agile. And so I had to come to terms with how entrepreneurs, what their relationship with the future was, how they changed. And after all, they do change the future. Entrepreneurial innovation changes the future, creates the future. And I ended up by figuring out that actually entrepreneurship is foresight. It is society's, or part of society's foresight, strategic foresight, is done by entrepreneurs. They shape and create and investigate and try out and experiment with the future. And I've published and written on that. So it was very, to me, that's particularly, that's absolutely central to business studies in that domain. So making it relevant. Obviously, in some business schools, strategic planning, strategic foresight, and I have a colleague in Lincoln, where I'm based now, that teaches that and knows all the stuff about scenarios and does it very well. And so it's a legitimate activity and teaching activity within business schools anyway. I don't have any problem with that. I mean, also now my chair is not in entrepreneurship and strategic foresight; it's in responsible foresight for sustainable development. So things have moved on. So businesses have to be hugely concerned with their impact and their relationship with sustainable development goals, their responsibilities for the future, their ethics. If we can't get businesses to think about the consequences of the future, if we can't get them to see what their responsibilities are and what differences they make, then we are failing dismally as business school academics. So I would say, if anything, futures foresight, responsible foresight, however you want to frame it, as you said.
But also find the overlap. I mean, from what you're saying, you managed to find the overlap between the two domains, and needed, necessary, urgent overlap.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And I connect it at Lincoln, where I'm based. I connect it to a UN-related activity called PRIME, which you may have come across, Principles for Responsible Management Education. So it sits within the broader narrative of PRIME, which is all about the things that I've said. So I don't see it as problematic whatsoever.
Wow.
The fact that I'm personally interested more broadly in a range of theories and a range of things that are undoubtedly outside the scope of normal business and management in a business school is my good fortune, really. So I tend to, I tend to talk about myself as being based at the university rather than a business school per se, but my role within the business school is contributes to the business education and research without any question.
That's amazing, Ted. Thanks so much for all these advices. I have taken a lot of your time, more than what we expected. So I thank you immensely for that. We had an extremely edifying conversation, one of the best in the series. So again, I truly appreciated this. I wish you and the Journal Futures the best.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Indeed, I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope people find it of value. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Take care.